Hello everybody. In this short video I'm going to explain the three concepts that are very important in database, and that's degree, modality, cardinality, plus I'm going to touch up on identifying, non-identifying. Now I have three scenarios where I have a taxi and a driver, and in the first scenario a taxi should be driven by only one driver. A driver can or might be assigned to only one taxi. When it comes to degree, if I build the relationship between taxi and driver in this scenario, it's going to be a binary. Why it's binary? Because I have two entities. There is the taxi, first entity, driver, the second one, and then they have attributes that I previously built, which is the ID, the make, model, and then for the driver is the first name, last name, in addition to the address, etc. Now, for this one, it says a taxi should be driven by only one driver. So I know it's a one going one side, and then a driver can or might be assigned to only one taxi. So this is a one-to-one, because it's one should be driven by one and can be driven by one. So it's a one-to-one, which is this one. So I'm going to build a one-to-one relationship between those two entities. Now, when it comes to the degree, we said it's binary, right? And then the modality, I'm gonna talk about it in a minute. The cardinality is a one-to-one. Okay, so the modality here, it says a taxi should be driven. That's a must. A taxi should be driven by one driver. So this one should be a mandatory, right? But here it says a driver can or might be assigned to only one taxi. So how about this one? Since it says can or might be, since this one is optional, so what I can do is go back to the relationship and change it to optional in the foreign key tab, which is this one here. This is where the foreign key taxi on one-to-one, they have the primary key, the driver, and then they have the foreign key here is the taxi driver. So I'm gonna change this one to optional and then close it. And as you can see here, it's mandatory on one side. A taxi must have a driver, should be driven by one, but then a driver can or might be. So we could have a driver that is just waiting, we have the driver in the database, but he wasn't assigned a taxi yet. So this one is optional. Now we go to the second scenario, still binary, right? And we're gonna see if it's gonna be a one-to-one, one-to-many, or a many-to-many. A taxi can be driven by one or more drivers. So a taxi can be driven by one or more drivers. So one-to-many, one or more, one-to-many drivers, right? A driver, on the other hand, must only drive one taxi. So on going back is one, but going from taxi to driver is one-to-many. A taxi can be driven by one or more. So from here to here we're gonna have a many, right? But going back, a driver must only be driven by one, must only drive one taxi. Okay, so it's a one-to-many. When we have a one-to-many, we always start with the many side. So it's a one-to-many. This is a one-to-many, and then we start from the many side, which is this one, and we go back. So it's a one-to-many. A taxi can be driven by one or more drivers. A driver must only drive one taxi. How about the modality? Here it says it can be driven by one. It could be can be driven or by one. When it says can, it also means zero. Can be driven. It can be driven by one. It can be driven by more. It can be driven by zero. It doesn't have a driver yet. Okay, so here the modality should be a zero since it's a can be. Okay, but going back, a driver must only drive one taxi. So a driver, to be in the database, he must or she must be assigned a taxi and should be driving a taxi. So this one here, we're gonna change it. We're gonna go to the foreign key and we say it can be driven. On this one is gonna be an optional, right, since it's a can. But then on the other side, going back, it must be mandatory, right? Matter of fact, I should do the opposite. So I'm gonna do this one, right, and then close it. So here, taxi can be driven by one or more drivers, right? So we always go to the foreign key. I'm gonna click on it again and go back to it, to see that my foreign key is always on the many side, is always here. This is the primary key. My foreign key is always on the many side. Don't get confused that this one is not this. It's not gonna change this. You're always gonna have to look here. What is your foreign key? It's on the many side, and this is the one you're gonna change from mandatory to optional, and it's gonna change it here. And then this one is gonna be left mandatory. This one is because if we close this, a taxi can be driven by one or more. Can be driven by one or more. But since it's a can be, it could also be a zero. Can be or cannot, right? So it's 0, 1, or many. A driver must only drive one taxi. A driver must only drive one taxi. This is a must. It's a mandatory. It's a must. Okay, so going back is a must, right? Now we go to the third scenario. But before I jump to the third scenario, we still having a binary. We don't have unary. We're gonna look at unary example in a minute. This is a binary. Okay, one entity going to another with the relationship. A degree is 1 to many. Modality is 0, mandatory on one side, optional on the other one. And I'm also going to talk about identify and identify in a minute. All right, so here a taxi can be assigned to one or more drivers. A driver can or might be assigned to one or more taxis. Okay, this one here is taxi can have more driver. A driver can drive more taxis. A many to many is a many to many. Okay, and whenever we have a many to many in database, we need to break it to two one to many relationships. Likely Workbench does it for us automatically. We don't have to do it manually. So if we go to a many to many here, and since it's a many to many, we don't have to start with the many side as we do in the one to many. So whether we click here or here, it doesn't matter. So it's a many to many, and now we have a third entity, which is the associative entity. That, of course, we can rename it. The associative entity is always going to have a primary key of the first one and the primary key of the second one. When they are together, they form a primary key of the associative entity. Each one by itself is a foreign key, because as we know, foreign key links to the primary key of the other entity. All right, this one links to this one links to this one. Right, but together they form a primary key. So we can click on this one. We can even add, for example, a third attribute that is going to say, for example, the date or time. I'm just going to put date for now. When the driver, for example, takes over a taxi, or is assigned a taxi, etc. And we can even make this one a strong primary key by making it a strong composite primary key. As you can see here, all those are primary keys. We can change the name. We can change the name to assignment or anything that makes sense to us. Doesn't matter. As long as it makes sense to us, it's good. So now we have, a many to many relationship. The modality, since it says a driver can be assigned to one or more drivers, can, and a driver can or might be, both of those could be changed to optional. I can do it, quickly if you want. So we're gonna go to where the foreign key is, change it here, and then close this one, and then go here and change it where the foreign key is, and change it here as well. So the foreign key is right here. Change it, close. And then since the reason I did that is because it says can instead of must. If you was saying must or should, then I wouldn't do that. Now we're gonna talk about unary relationship. When do we have a binary? When do we have unary? So if I go here and it says some drivers are team leaders and supervise other drivers. So those team leaders, in addition to being team leaders, they are also drivers. So that you cannot be a team leader if you are not a driver. That's why it says some drivers. Also a keyword, very important, some drivers. Not all drivers are, supervised. So if we go to this first one, for example, we're gonna build. We're not gonna build another entity here called team leaders. Why? Because team leaders are also drivers. That's why it needs to be unary. It needs to be going to itself. So what we will do is build a one to many. Since it says some supervise many, 0 or many, and I'm going to explain why it's 0. So I'm going to do a one to many, As you can see here, one too many. Some drivers supervise others. You know, a team leader, when somebody is team leader, he supervises one or many drivers. But what happens when a driver is not a team leader? How many drivers he's going to supervise? He's going to supervise 0. So this one here needs to be optional, since it says some drivers. Some of them, they supervise drivers, but there are some of them that are not supervisors. They're going to supervise 0 drivers. So this one here, when on the foreign key part, is going to change to 0. So we're going to go to the foreign key, change this one, and now it's optional on the menu side. This one is unary, what's called also recursive, because the team leaders are not separate from drivers. They are drivers. They are drivers too that supervise other drivers. So whenever we have one part of others, you understand, it's become recursive. That's why we cannot build, for example, another entity called captains or team leaders or supervisors and link it to this one and make it binary, because in addition to being supervisors, they are also drivers. If it says, you know, we have admins that are not supervisors, and those admins, they supervise the drivers, yes, then you build another entity called admins and you link it. Now we jump to unidentified, non-identified. So when it becomes unidentified, when it becomes non-identified. So if I say in the exercise, for example, those drivers are, I'm gonna pick this one specifically because the driver must only drive one taxi. So this one here, if I say we hire drivers and we keep them in the database, we keep them data in the database, whether they are assigned taxis or not, they're gonna be in as long as they have their driver license or you know, a taxi driver license, which is maybe a special license. As long as they have that, they're gonna be kept in the database, and if they are needed, we're gonna call them, etc. So we are keeping them in the database whether they are having a taxi or not. So in that case, this relationship will be a non-identifying, and we're gonna go back to the foreign key and we're gonna make this one non-identifying, okay? Because this ID doesn't depend on the taxi ID. See, this one here, since it's an associative entity, this one is always going to be identifying. Always going to be identifying, because we cannot have assignments if we don't have a driver and a taxi, because this one is a weak entity. Compared to these two, because we cannot have assignment if one of these two is missing. Matter of fact, the ID of the assignment is formed partially of the ID of the driver and the taxi, as we explained earlier. This one, on the other hand, is non-identifying, because we still gonna have drivers. They don't depend on the taxis to be in the database, etc. Now, if I say that for a driver to be kept in the database, they need to have they only gonna be in the database if they have a taxi assigned, and part of their ID is gonna be the taxi ID as well, then this is a different story. This one here in that scenario is gonna become unidentified, and then what we will do is make part here is gonna be a composite primary key. Each driver, in addition to have the driver ID, we're gonna also add this one as a primary key. As you can see here, the moment we did this one, identifying this one already, Workbench made this one as a primary key as well, as you can see that. So if I look at this one here, primary key, if I go back and change that to a non-identifying, and this is why you need to understand the difference is very important, because it affects the primary key, affects the type of relationship that you're gonna have. So the moment I make this one non-identifying, if I go to the driver, you know, you should not have the taxi as a primary key, and exactly now the taxi is a foreign key, not a primary key. Okay, when I make it identifying, the taxi becomes part of the primary key, because in weak entities, just like we have in the associative entities, the primary key always, part of it is gonna be the primary key of the if we can call it the parent entities. Okay, again, part of the primary key of any weak entity, right, is gonna be, part of it is gonna be the primary key of the other entities, just like we have in associative entities. So in associative entities, always gonna be identifying. Here in one-to-many, for example, it depends on the scenario. if a driver needs the taxi ID to be kept in the database, meaning it depends on the